Everybody be seated. State name. Mr. Evans?
Yes, sir. Dr. Dela Cruz, hello.
Hello, how are you?
Doing fine. Let's get a few preliminary matters out of the way. You've indicated you've been to prison before, so you have been convicted of a felony. How many felonies have you been convicted of?
Well, I have 5 prior prison terms, so each prison term is a felony. So I think I went to prison twice for residential burglaries, and 1 time for sales of heroin, and twice for petty theft with a prior, which was made into a felony.
Okay, and you're getting paid for your testimony. What's your hourly billing?
I bill at $200 an hour.
And how much have you billed so far?
$16,000.
Now, Mr. Prince asked you about testifying in court before.
Correct.
You have testified quite a number of times. Every time's been for the defense, hasn't it?
Always for the defense.
You've never testified for the state or the government?
No, I never have.
Now, your dissertation was in reference to a street gang in Stockton, California. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And it related to how the system, the community, law enforcement, and educational system all related to how youths in Stockton, California got involved in gangs in Stockton, California. Is that correct?
Well, I was looking at whether or not what the impact was, what the impact law enforcement, the community, family, schools had on their decision to join a gang. That's what it was about.
And when it comes to gang membership and how you review it, and there's not a real consensus in the scientific community of what the criteria is there?
Actually, when I did this dissertation, I uncovered 8 characteristics that gang members generally have. There's 8 of them. Now, the group that I did, there was 56. Initially, there was 56 individuals that I interviewed the first time. The first interview was 56 individuals, and then I ended up with 4 individuals to complete the dissertation. What I found in those 56 individuals, and what I have found during the time that I've been doing this, whether it be in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, or Newark, New Jersey, or Portland, Oregon, or Salt Lake City, or Los Angeles, or San Francisco, San Jose, wherever the case may be, is that when it is a gang member, they have these characteristics. When they're not gang member, they'll have some of the characteristics, but not all of them. Just like in my population that I studied, out of the 56, 46 of them, 83%, had all 8 characteristics. 9 of them had 7 of the characteristics, and then 1 had 6 of the characteristics. Now, when I interview an individual and he only has 3, then I don't consider him a gang member.
Okay. Now, I've asked you that question before, haven't I?
I'm not sure if you did.
Let me show you, see if this refreshes your record.
What's that? Well, go ahead, Mr. Evans. I'll overrule the objection at this point.
Let me show you, you recall a depot that
Yeah, I
you were
remember
given?
the demo.
All right. And you think if you reviewed it, it would refresh your recollection?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. Page 11 of the first depot. And there were actually 2 depositions of you in this case, is that correct?
Yes, I think we did the first one, and then you guys came back and did it again.
Okay. And I'm referring to, for the record, the January 30th, 2017, beginning on page 10.
Is it 10?
Beginning on page 10 and going on to page 11.
What line, page 10? All of page 10?
Let's start off at line 5, and if you'll
Okay.
read through it through, let's just do page 10. I think that covers the meat of what I want to ask you about.
Okay, I read it.
All right. Now, you said before there's a lack of consensus as who qualifies as a gang member. Is that correct?
There's a lack of consensus between me and the police department. That's what I meant by that. So we don't agree. In other words, the police department is saying this guy's a gang member based on this, this, this. I'm saying, no, he's not a gang member because this does not, they're not indicators of that person being a gang member. That was the lack of consensus that I was talking about.
You ignored, and there was also a lack of consensus in the scientific community, isn't there?
There is a lack of consensus of what constitutes a gang by many social scientists, and the reason for that is that most of these guys, in fact, all of them that I know, and I know quite a few of them, have never been in a gang. So they're looking at it from a academic point of view, right? Which is a little bit almost the same as the police department's point of view. So I'm looking at it from not only an academic point of view, but from a personal. I've been on the inside, so I understand. So I bring that uniqueness to this particular phenomenon.
But you will agree there is no peer-reviewed articles or anything that you reviewed in order to reach the determination of your conclusions today. Is that correct?
I don't understand the question. To reach what analysis or what conclusion?
That this had the indications of a gang killing.
On this particular case?
Yes.
No, I don't agree with that.
Now, you've taken on the deposition that was taken on February 2nd, 2017. Beginning on line 14 through page 19.
On February, you said?
Yeah, the February one.
Okay. On what page?
Beginning on page 18
18. Okay.
through page 19. See,
All the way?
through line 12.
So line 1 on page 18 all the way to line 12 on page 19? Okay. You want me to read it?
To yourself, to
Okay.
see if it refreshes
All right,
your recollection as to what we previously talked about.
Okay.
Now, I asked you the question about whether there were any peer-reviewed documents that were
remember.
reviewed and the criteria for determining whether something is gang murder or not. And you pointed me to that I could go online and see an article in the Phoenix Daily News, the Phoenix,
Yeah.
Arizona Daily News.
I remember, yes.
Okay. And you also told me, as far as studies, that you can't tell there are any studies in that say that. Is that correct?
That's not correct. I read a few studies, a few articles.
What did you tell me that day?
Hold on.
No.
I told you there was no
You said
studies.
that's not what you said.
I said there was no studies conducted up to that point on the actual methodology, what cartels do. That's what I said.
And that was on February 2nd of 2017.
That's correct.
All right, are you fixing to tell us all of a sudden, after February 2nd, 2017, there are now some studies that you discovered after the deposition before you're testifying today?
I'm not telling you that if I can finish. What I am saying is that since then, I've researched and found articles written by academics alluding to what they do, but no research, scientific studies. And the reason that there isn't no scientific studies is because it's a dangerous thing to do. Academics do not want to go to Mexico and put themselves in the predicament where they might get their head cut off. And that's why there is no scientific studies conducted thus far.
Now, the studies you referred me to back in February when I asked you, you indicated that you know about these tactics based upon all the information that you read online, newspaper articles, the New York Times magazines, different magazines that you read. But as far as academic research studies, no. I can't tell you of any, sir, off the top of my head.
That's correct.
Now, you indicated on direct that when you were talking about knowing that that the cartels use a woman to go up and knock on the door to try to gain entry because people are generally more comfortable with women. And you pointed to the personal experience that your brother had been murdered back in August of 1977, is that correct?
That's correct.
So that was 40 years ago, is that correct?
That was 40 years ago, yes.
And I think you also indicated that the people who carried that murder out was not the Mexican drug cartel, was it?
No, that was Nuestra Familia,
Okay.
criminal organization.
And you learned about the Mexican drug cartel because you talked to was it your nephew or cousin who was wound up being killed by the federales in Mexico in a shootout?
Well, actually, I've interacted with them a number of times. I think I said that. I had a cousin named Ernesto, who was also involved in the distribution of drugs. And him and I went in 1978 to Durango to pick up heroin. So I've had interactions with drug cartel members other than the family back in the day when I was a criminal. It's like not something unique because I wasn't your regular criminal back then. So, in the neighborhood, in any Latino neighborhood, it's not very difficult to learn about drug cartels and what people are doing in the underworld. It's not that difficult, especially somebody like me that has come from there. It's not that difficult.
Yeah, but it's been 40 years since you said you were involved with gangs.
Since I said I was involved with gangs, but not since I've been involved in crime. It's only been 21 years since I was actually involved in crime myself.
And that was in California, correct?
California, New York, it doesn't really matter. I've interacted with people that are from New York, that are from Florida, that have been in the penitentiaries that I've been in, and the same thing they do in Florida, that's the same thing they do in California. The bottom line, they're all criminals. All of them think alike in general. So there's not that much of a difference.
All right, so you interact with criminals to figure out who is involved and how they commit the crimes. You also Google it on the internet, articles to figure out how they're doing it. Then you come in and you testify before juries what you read on the internet.
No, I do exactly what the police do. I go into the community and I talk to people just like they do, and then I come in and then I use my experience, and then I research and I review documents and different journals, and then I come in and give my expertise.
Well, you know, all the journals you kept referring me to during our depositions involved you going on the internet, doing online research, newspaper articles, and magazines and news stories on the internet.
Well, because there's not that much academic material on cartels.
And you learned about the Ace of Spades being a calling card for the Zetas because you talked to your now dead cousin who was involved in drugs in Mexico.
Yes, I think that's pretty reliable if he was a member, and he was.
And you base the fact that there were footprints in the blood in the foyer near the body as a sign that there were a whole lot of people who were obviously involved in this crime. Is that correct?
Well, that's one of the elements that I used.
All right,
The fact that there
and
was-
did you factor in the fact that 3 police officers walked through the front door, past the body, going through that same area in order to clear the house?
Well, the reason I didn't take that into account was because policemen are trained not to walk on blood in a crime scene, not to disturb the crime scene. So in my mind, I didn't believe that a police officer would be so ill-trained to walk into a crime scene and leave his footprints all over the crime scene. So to me, it indicated that it wasn't a police officer's footprints, that therefore it had to be somebody else's.
Okay, so you don't know whether or not the officers entered the front door, had to go by the body and all the blood that was around the body and around the front door in order to clear the house.
Well, I don't know where the footprints were exactly. I was only reading and evaluating the information from the forensic scientists that provided the information.
You don't have any forensic training, do you?
I do not.
And so what you were doing is the same thing you've done when you testified the rest of this jury. You read what somebody else did, and now you're giving this jury your opinion based upon what you read somebody else came to a conclusion for.
Well, that's one of the elements that I'm using. The viciousness of the crime is another one.
Oh,
And the
let's
fact-
talk about the viciousness of crime. Domestics. Are domestic cases vicious crimes?
Sure.
So, but you've excluded domestic as being part of this, haven't you?
Yeah, but not killing of children. That's the main issue, the killing of children.
All right, so there are no domestic cases where children are killed.
Not in that fashion. I don't know. I don't know of any. There might be.
You haven't read any about any on the internet, have you?
No, I have not, sir.
Okay. Thank you. No
You're
further
welcome.
questions.
Redirect. No redirect, Judge. All right. Did you ever have a question of this witness? All right, we'll go to sidebar.
Oh, yeah. You're welcome. Well, that's not mine.
In your opinion, would it have to involve a significant amount of money to cause this type of retribution?
I think that it would have to involve, a substantial amount of money. I don't think they would do it for, 10,000 or, it would have to probably be, I couldn't put a number on it, but I don't think they would do it for $10. I think that, it would have to be a substantial amount. Now, what's substantial? Well, that's something that you have to ask them, because I can't really say, so what's substantial to me might not be substantial to them,
Any follow-up, Mr. Prince? There you are. Follow-up from the state?
And what are you basing that opinion on?
Just on personal knowledge. I know if somebody stole from me back in the day, I'm gonna get even somehow. And that's the criminal mentality of individuals involved in this particular type of milieu.
Okay, it's based upon personal experience
Yeah.
40 years ago.
Well, 20 years ago, actually, 21.
Okay.
Any further, Mr. Prince? No, Your Honor. All right, you can step down. Do we need to keep this witness any further? No, Your Honor. All right, you're
Okay.
excused.
Thank you very much.
Call your next witness.
Time, Your Honor, the defense will call Kevin Noppinger.
place the clerk to be sworn, please, sir?
Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you give in this case will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Have a seat. Slide up the microphone, please, sir. May proceed.
Thank you, Your Honor. Mr. Noppinger, can you please introduce yourself to the jury, spelling your first and last name for the court reporter?
It's Kevin Noppinger, K-E-V-I-N, last name N-O-P-P-I-N-G-E-R.
And what do you do for a living?
I'm a DNA consultant.
What does that mean?
Well, I worked in the forensic field for over 30 years. I do consulting work for attorneys on DNA cases, sometimes civil, sometimes criminal cases, to review work previously done and make recommendation if DNA could help their case.
I want to go through some of your history. Before I go through the specifics of your training, education, and professional experience, can you give us just kind of an overview of what you've spent your career doing?
Okay. Well, I received a bachelor's degree in forensic science from the University of Central Florida, master's degree in biology from Florida International University. Out of college, I started working with the state of Alabama. That would have been back in 1978 in the field of in serology. There was no DNA back then. 1982, I changed employment to the Florida Department of Law Enforcement. Worked with them in the crime laboratory. Again, at that time with the FDLE, there was no DNA. I switched employment in 1989 to the Broward County Sheriff's Office in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, where they were starting a DNA program down there. I was trained in 1989 in DNA at the FBI Academy in Quantico, Virginia. Started doing DNA casework in 1990, and I retired. And then through my career with Broward County till 2008, I retired. I was performing DNA casework. I then started a private DNA lab called DNA Labs International in South Florida. We handled civil and criminal DNA casework throughout the United States and in the Caribbean countries. I've testified over 500 times in about 10 different states and probably that many different foreign countries in the field of forensic science. After I left my private lab, I was hired by the U.S. State Department, worked with the embassy down in Trinidad and Tobago for a year in 2015, trying to help the Forensic Science Center in Trinidad and Tobago maintain accreditation, starting a national DNA data bank, collecting samples from prisoners and such, and to try to get them to be ISO or nationally accredited laboratory.
Okay. Explain for us, I guess let's go all the way back in time, beginning in the early 80s, and explain what each of your jobs required. Let's talk first about your job with FDLE from 82 to 89. What were you doing for FDLE exactly?
Well, just a forensic serologist, just analyzing samples from criminal cases for identification of blood. And back we did field blood typing. We looked at a few enzymes to try to include or exclude individuals.
So back then you could. What about down at D5 in the bottom left?
D5 there's one major peak. Again, there's a 7 and a 12. Again, I agreed with Ms. Brown on the 7. It could be consistent with one of her daughters. The 12 is not from anybody. So the 12 is definitely a foreign allele from somebody not in that household.
Another thing that I just want to clarify, at a lot of these locus where you're identifying foreign allele, we're only seeing one allele number for the foreign donor. Why is that? Can you clarify why that would be?
Yeah, that's because it's a small amount of DNA that's present on the item. So you could have what we call dropout. It's just at that threshold. One allele could be below and one could be above the threshold. And so therefore, the instrument is only going to detect that one allele that's above the threshold. That's what we call dropout. So just because you see one allele does not mean that that's that person's DNA profile. He could have any other allele that just dropped out.
Okay. Is there any, was there any evidence of foreign contribution at D13 on the middle of the bottom row?
Yeah, D13, the 12 allele was inconsistent with Ms. Peters and her children.
Okay, and we didn't get any reading on profiler for D7, right? The bottom right there?
Right.
Okay. Switching to defense and public 1B, which is the profiler electrophoregram. D3 we already talked about, which is the top left on this one, right? This is a duplicate of what we saw in the profiler, egram?
Yes, this is a second kit, and there's two loci that are duplicates.
Okay. What about D16? Is that one that we haven't talked about yet?
Right, we have not talked about that. That D16 shows an 11 allele that is foreign.
Okay. And then what about amylogenin's going to be the same, right?
Amylogen shows again there's male contributor the same.
Okay. And what about THO?
THO shows two very small foreign alleles, the 8 and the 9 alleles.
And both of those were identified as foreign?
Yes, sir.
Okay. What's the next one going across to the right?
Next
there?
one's TPOX, TPOX. There, again, you can see a very minor allele right there, a 9 allele, which is foreign.
So just the one allele present at TPOX right there?
Yes, sir.
Okay. How about at CSF in the middle row all the way to the right?
Yes, CSF doesn't show any foreign alleles. They're all consistent with Ms. Peters.
Okay. And then we have D7 at the bottom right. Did we get any reading for D7 on co-filer here?
On co-filer, you did. On D7, there's the 10 allele that is foreign,
The 10 you said is?
the 10.
Okay. At some point, Mr. Noppinger, did you have an opportunity to review the electrophoregram developed from the testing of a buccal swab for Antonio Avila Quinones?
Yes, I did.
You may approach the witness, Your Honor. Let the record reflect I've shown the witness that the marked for identification only is exhibit 2A and 2B. Do you recognize that to be the electrophoregram developed by the Florida Department of Law Enforcement for Mr. Avila Quinones?
Yes, sir.
Is that a true and accurate copy of the electrophoregram for him?
Yes, sir.
Your Honor, at this time I move the evidence with pretty much identification only as defense composite exhibit 1A, or I'm sorry, 2A and 2B into evidence as defense composite exhibit 2A and 2B.
Any objection? I thought we'd already admitted it, actually. If
No.
not, okay.
No, this one is not been your first stipulation. You can,
To be admitted?
Request permission to publish.
You may.
Okay. Mr. Noppinger, did you have an opportunity to review, well, tell us first what we're looking at. When you have a known standard from a buccal swab and it's processed, what does the electrophoregram depict?
So this is a good example of a single source individual. You either have one allele, one peak, or two. Typically, when you see like the first location, that the peak height will be twice as high as the other one. So, you know, if you have two alleles together, that peak is going to be high. So you can see it's a homozygous or single one at 12 allele at this location, D8. You can see the two alleles at each of the other location. One thing I should point out, this is a different kit than the previous electrophoregrams. So there's still the same genetic markers as a couple extra ones, but if you remember, we had the Y marker here. So we still can compare, but they're not in the same location. So you can see heterozygosity, one from mother, one from father at all the location. He is a homozygous at one location.
Now, when you say a different kit, what does that mean exactly? Can you clarify what that is, what that means exactly for the jury?
Yeah, there's different DNA profiling kits. The first electrophoregrams that were done on the phone, it was two actually kits together called Profiler Plus and Cofiler. So you had to amplify some of the sample with one kit and some with the other kit. Well, as years came on, they combined these two kits into one kit, which is this kit here called Identifiler. So those 12 genetic markers that were looked at plus the sex marker all combined into this kit, plus there's two additional markers in this kit. But validation studies done show that the two kits, what you get profile on one kit, you will get with using this single kit.
Okay. Now, The additional locus that appear on the Identifiler Plus kit, those can't, or can they, be used in comparison to a sample with less markers?
That's correct. There's two that were not done on the original sample. They weren't available at that time.
So that additional information would be of no use or no help in doing a comparison?
That's correct.
Okay. Based on the two DNA profiles developed, the partial profile for the minor contributor from the evidentiary sample and the full profiler from Mr. Avila Quinones, were you able to do a comparison and complete statistical inclusion for Mr. Avila for the possibility of Mr. Avila being a contributor to the minor contributor's profile?
Yes, sir.
Okay. May I approach the witness again, Your Honor? I'm bringing the witness, both defense and prosecutor, 1A and 1B, 1A and 1B, and 2A and 2B.
Through a projector for the
Yes, sir.
moment.
Thank you. Let's talk about D8 first. In the evidentiary sample, what was the allele number for the foreign donor identified?
The foreign allele on that was a 12.
And does Mr. Avila have a 12 at D8?
Yes, sir.
Okay. What's the next locus at which foreign DNA was identified?
Well, if I can go from the original profiler one, there was on the VWA, there was a 17 allele that was foreign.
Does Mr. Avila have a 17 at VWA?
Yes, sir, he does.
Okay.
The FGA, there was a 21-25 that was identified.
Does Mr. Avila have a 21 and a 25 at that locus?
Yes, sir, he does.
Okay. What's the next locus at which there's foreign DNA?
Well, the D8 we just discussed. The next foreign was D18, S51. That was a 18 allele that was detected, that was foreign.
Does Mr. Avila have an 18 at D18?
Yes, sir, he does.
What's the next locus at which foreign DNA was identified?
That was on a D5S813. And at the D5S13, there was a 12 allele.
Does Mr. Avila have a 12 at D5?
Yes, sir, he does.
Okay. What's the next locus at which there's foreign DNA identified?
The D13 locus, there was a 12 allele that was foreign.
Okay. Does Mr. Avila have a 12 at that locus?
Yes, sir, he does.
All right. What's the next one where there's foreign DNA?
The D16, there was an 11 allele that was foreign.
Okay. Does Mr. Avila have an 11 at D16?
Yes, sir, he does.
All right. What's the next locus at which there's foreign DNA present?
That was the THO allele, THO1. There was a 8 and 9 allele detected at THO.
Does Mr. Avila have both an 8 and a 9 at THO?
Yes, sir, he does.
Okay. What's the next locus at which there's foreign DNA present?
That was TPOX. There was a 9 allele.
Does Mr. Avila have a 9 at TPOX?
Yes, sir.
Okay. What's the next one?
Next one is D7, where there was a 10 allele.
All right. Does Mr. Avila have a 10 at D7?
Yes, sir.
All right. Is that all of them?
That's all.
Based on those matching numbers, were you able to perform statistical inclusion for Mr. Avila?
Yes, I did some calculations on that.
Okay. Tell the jury what that means, what statistical inclusion is and how that process works.
Well, I only took the foreign alleles that were present, and there's various population data banks that we can look at. At each of those locations, you could figure out a statistics of how many people would have that. For example, if you're looking at a 10 allele in some locus, you test 100 people and you see out of 100 people, maybe 40 of them would have that 10 allele. So 40% of the population would be included. So at each of these locations there's probabilities in a population of randomly selecting individuals, how you would do it. So it's kind of like it's kind of like gambling. The odds of finding, let's say, that one person is 40 out of 100, the next may be 50 out of 100, the next may be 10 out of 100. because they're independent events like rolling dice, you can multiply those frequencies together to obtain an overall statistic of finding somebody at random that would have those alleles.
So, do I understand you correctly that the more DNA information you have, the more alleles you have at the more locus, the larger the statistical value is going to be, is that right?
Yes, sir, that's exactly right.
Okay. And in this case, you had 10 locus at which there was foreign allele identified, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And based on the foreign allele present at each of those 10 locus, what were the inclusion statistics for Mr. Avila?
Well, I have it broken down into the Caucasian population. Of that would be one person in 1,200 individuals. Of the African American would be one person in 600. And in the Hispanic would be one person in around 15,000 individuals would have either those two alleles or a single allele at those locations.
And Mr. Avila is in fact Hispanic, correct?
I don't know.
You don't know? Okay, fair enough. Now, when you say that the frequency of occurrence is 1 in 15,000, does that mean that you would expect only one person in a 15,000 person sample of Hispanics to have those allele at those 10 locus?
Well, there's statistics. That's the odds of finding individuals. I mean, you may have 2. I wouldn't expect to have 100.
Okay.
So it's a mathematical calculation. Like, again, it's similar to rolling the dice. It's the probability of finding that. Is it common or is it rare?
Explain to the jury how those inclusion probabilities were developed, how population samples were obtained, and how the guidelines for doing those inclusion statistics were developed.
Well, again, it was based on minimum of 100 individuals in the population. Most of them have a lot more than that in these, let's say, these 3 racial groups. You profile those individuals with all the alleles. You count how many people have the 5 allele, how many have the 6, the 7, the 8, and then out of those 100, 200 people that you have, that's how you get the frequency of 5% of the population would have this allele, 10% would have this allele. Some alleles are more common than others, and so that's where you get those frequencies from each of the locations, the locus.
Is it true that when, in terms of general frequency of occurrence for that genetic profile, or general probability that that profile will exist, is it true that if the frequency of occurrence is 1 in 15,000, you would expect generally that 14,999 of that same population sample would be excluded from that genetic profile?
Yes, in a random population, yes, sir.
So stating it as the inverse, generally you would expect 99.95% of the Hispanic population to be excluded from being a contributor to that profile.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Do you agree with Analyst Brown that in a sample like the evidentiary sample we're analyzing here, that when there's evidence of contribution by more than 2 people, the presence of an allele that doesn't match a known subject would not necessarily exclude that subject from being the minor contributor to the partial profile?
Yes, sir.
Okay, and can you tell us why?
Well, again, if it's more than 2 people in a mixture, then, unless you have a reference sample from that individual, it's difficult to determine where that allele goes to, what's the partner allele that's present.
Okay. Tell me a little bit about what Y testing is, when it was developed, and how FDLE uses it today.
Well, this is an excellent case for Y testing. Y testing this is what we call autosomal. You get half your DNA from your mother, half your DNA from your father, typically used in paternity testing. Y DNA is just what it says. It is looking at the Y chromosome genetic markers that are present only on the Y chromosome. So my Y is exactly like my father's, my grandfather's, the great-grandfather's. So when they do these genealogy tests, they do look at the Y chromosome for people as well to see where you would have come from. The Y testing has been around since the late part of probably around 2000, at least 2008, to at least, 2008, at least a little bit before that. The reason the Y testing would be great on a case like this, females don't have a Y chromosome. So this is a mixture, it's a complicated mixture with different people. Y testing on this particular sample, you would not find any of the profile from the woman. You would only from the man. So you wouldn't have to worry about so much about whether it's been masked by the other allele. It's very sensitive. It's much more sensitive than autosomal DNA testing. So a sample like this, you would only see the Ys. You could tell if it's one male individual, two male individual. You would get, I suspect, almost a complete profile with Ys because the sensitivity is extremely high compared to the autosomal.
Do I understand you correctly that if FDLE had done Y testing on this sample, we wouldn't have seen Brandi or any contribution from the twins?
That is correct.
Okay. In which case, we would have been able to tell if the 7 and the 14 that you and Joellen Brown dropped and identified as probably not being foreign, we would know for certain if FDLE had done that testing whether the 14 and the 7 were in fact foreign or did belong to the girls, or at least belong to some girls.
Well, you're looking at different markers. They're not the same markers. But you would be able to see, you would see one peak. If you saw two peaks, you would know there'd be two male individuals in there. So even with two, with one, it's very easy. Even with two, it's pretty easy to determine because you only have one peak height to worry about. So it would make a sample like this very clear if you wanted to compare it to male individuals.
Did FDLE have the ability to do that type of testing in 2011, 2010?
I believe around that time, if not a little bit after that.
Okay. And what does FDLE do with extracts, or what is an extract? How long did they save that for?
The DNA, like a case like this, a lot of times it's just a cotton swab. You wet the swab, you rub the item to try to take the DNA off of that. From the cotton swab, you cut the cotton swab, you put it into some liquid to extract the DNA and to sort of purify it. And that's what we call the DNA extract. From that liquid portion, the purified liquid portion, you take out to amplify it on these various kits. So that is typically frozen. I think FDLE does return it back to the agency when they're done their DNA testing, the DNA extract.
But it's saved, right?
Yes.
And so if FDLE didn't have the ability to do Y testing in late 2010 when the investigation began, they would have had that extract and been able to do the Y testing at some point in the near future after that.
I don't want to jack all that as speculation. You have no idea what the capabilities or how this information is actually stored.
And this is long after he's left FDLE, if I remember the chronology of events. That's not correct.
That is correct.
I'll sustain it.
In the course of your work as a DNA consultant, DNA expert, have you had opportunities to review cases involving DNA testing done by the Florida Department of Law Enforcement?
Yes, sir.
Have you had opportunity to review the developing standard operating procedures for the Florida Department of Law Enforcement after the time when you left?
Yes, sir.
Have you had an opportunity to review the protocol that they use in interpreting DNA profiles, review their interpretive guidelines since the time that you left the Florida Department of Law Enforcement?
Yes, sir.
Are you familiar with their standard operating procedures pertaining to preserving extract for later analysis?
Yes, sir.
Does that include the time period following when you left the Florida Department of Law Enforcement?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Are you likewise familiar, based on your experience working in this state as a DNA expert and DNA consultant, with when the Florida Department of Law Enforcement started using the Identifiler Plus kit and Mini-Filer kit as opposed to Co-Filer and Profiler?
Well, I'm familiar they're using it. I don't know the exact dates they started using them.
Okay. Are you familiar with the time frame during which the Florida Department of Law Enforcement started doing Y testing?
I believe it was within the past 3 years, if not sooner.
Okay. Okay. Based on that, I would ask then the same question that I was asking before. Knowing FDLE's guidelines for preserving extract and knowing within the last 3 years that they developed the ability to do Y testing, is that something that you would have expected FDLE to do in a case like this?
Your Honor, again, I'm going to object. You have no idea whether people return to
Sustain the objection.
Okay. Can you tell the court a little bit, or tell the jury a little bit about the importance of using interpretive guidelines that are validated for use with a specific kit?
Like I mentioned now, in this case, they use 2 different DNA profiling kits. Before you use any kit or any new instrument, you must validate it, which means running the same sample through it multiple times. You do what we call a dilution study to see the sensitivity of the sample. You do mixture studies, mixing two individuals and sometimes 3 individuals together to determine when you would have like dropout alleles that would disappear. So with that particular kit, you determine an SOP or standing operating procedures and interpretation guidelines, what you would call an allele, what you would call dropout or stutters. So it's very kit dependent as well as instrument dependent. So then if they switched to identifier, they had to do the same validation studies all over again based on that kit and the performance of that kit. Sensitivity, mixtures, what we call thresholds, reproducibility studies, sensitivity studies, all of that. And then you base guidelines, SOP guidelines based on that kit. You cannot interchange interpretation guidelines from one kit to another because you validated it separately. They're 2 kits. They act differently a lot of times.
Have you had an opportunity to review the work of each of the other 3 DNA people involved in this case? By which I mean you, Joe Ellen Brown, Jason Bundy, and Kevin McElfresh.
Yes, sir.
Which of those experts used the interpretive guidelines in conducting their work validated for use with co-filer and profiler, which is what this evidentiary exhibit was tested on?
Well, what I read was Miss Bundy and myself used
You mean Ms. Brown?
Miss Brown, sorry. Miss Brown and myself for the profiler, co-filer kits.
Thank you. I have no further questions at this time.
All right, well, we take 10 minutes.
Ms. Novinger, let's just talk real quick about these different electrophorograms, the D-grams, if you will. Looking at 2B, and I think you already covered this, but as you said, this is your typical of what you would see as it relates to a single individual. You get one from each parent, right?
Correct.
Okay. So at each one of the loci, you normally expect to see 2, but there are circumstances where you would only see 1, correct?
Yes, sir.
And that's because in this particular case, Mr. Avila's DNA at the letter T8, is a 12-12.
Yes, sir.
Okay. So whenever you move into a multiple donor situation, you would expect to see more than these 2, correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And with a 3 or more, you would be in a situation where you would expect to see at least 5 peaks typically, correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And then a situation where you're talking about 2 donors, you're typically going to see no more than 4 peaks, correct?
In most circumstances, yes, sir.
Okay. So whenever you do these comparisons in a situation where you're talking about 3 donors, you can have dropouts and things along those lines, and some of them are subsumed with the other. What's that called? Stacking or something like that? What's that called?
Yes, sir. Stacking.
Okay. And whenever we're talking about just 2 donors, you typically only have 4 different peaks at each loci, and therefore you would expect to see that that's a typically of 2-person donor situation, correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And in this particular case, if we look at Defense Exhibit 1A, at each one of these markers, here at D3, we see 2 peaks, correct?
Correct.
Okay. And at BWA, we see 4 peaks.
Correct.
And then here at FGA, it looks like we see 4 peaks, but 2 of them are kind of really small, right?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And then we come down to this one right here, and of course we're talking about the XY, and we talked about that. Of course, XX is female, XY is male.
Yes, sir.
And then here at D8, looks like we have 3 peaks,
Yes, sir.
and D21, 2 peaks,
Yes,
and D18, we're back to 3 peaks.
correct.
And moving down to, I can't read that one.
D5.
D5, we have 3 peaks,
Yes,
and D13, we have 2 peaks.
correct.
Okay. And then we move on to 1B. And here, again, at D3, we have 2 peaks.
Yes,
And at D16, we have 3 peaks.
correct.
Again, we have our X and Y.
Yes, sir.
And here again at THO, we have 3 peaks.
Yes,
And at TPOX, we have 3 peaks. Correct?
correct.
And then over here at, which one's that?
CSF.
CSF, we have 2 peaks.
Yes,
Right? No point anywhere on exhibit 1A or 1B do we see 5 peaks, which would be an indicator of 3 donors, correct?
that's correct.
Okay. And in fact, you made your initial determination as this, that this is consistent with being a 2-donor sample, correct?
It's consistent but not ruled out, yes.
Okay. But you didn't see any indicators of a 3-person donor, correct?
Well, the peak, no, there was not more than 4 alleles, but the peaks and the dropout issue would not rule out 3. I can't say positively because you don't see 5 alleles.
But you didn't see any indications of a 3rd-party donor, did you?
I wouldn't rule it out, but I didn't see any indication, but I would not rule it out.
So by not ruling out, what does that mean if you're not ruling it? You didn't see any indications of it, but you're not ruling it out. How is that?
Well, if you look at his sample, it's really nice, pristine, very nice peak heights. This sample, the peaks are very low. You could see sometimes above the baseline the little bump that it didn't call. I think D7 is a good example. There's 2 different kits. One kit, you only detected 2 alleles. The other kit, you detected 3. So that would indicate the dropout. So there's missing alleles. If all the peaks were up around 1,000, I would definitely agree with you that it's only a 2-person sample. But because of how low the peaks are and the fact that imbalance, that I wouldn't really rule out a 3rd. There isn't any hard evidence to say there's 3 people. I agree with that. There's not 5 alleles, but a lot of imbalance and a lot of dropouts. So I wouldn't really rule it out.
Okay. Let's talk real quick, if we can, about whenever you've got a 2-person donor, you're going to see alleles from your major, which in this case is Brandi Peters, right?
Yes,
And you're going to see 1 or 2 donors from your secondary minor contribution if you've got a 2-person donor, correct?
if the DNA concentrations are different, yes. Because the peak height is determined on concentration of DNA.
2-person donor, 4 alleles at each loci, or possibly 3 depending on 2, 3, or 4. Let me just put it that way. If it's a 2-donor system, you're going to see 2, 3, or 4, correct?
If they have the same amount, you may even see 1.
Fair enough. I'm sorry, but there could be 1, right?
Yes, correct.
All right. So let's take a look real quick. Let's look at DWA. Now, Ms. Peters is a 15-18, correct?
Yes, sir.
15 and 18. There's where our peaks are, right?
Yes.
Okay. Mr. Avila, however, is the 1718, correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay. But this one also has a 14, does it not?
Yes, sir.
Mr. Avila's not a 14. Ms. Peters is not a 14.
That's correct.
So the only way that you can include Mr. Avila as being a potential donor of this is if there's a third donor.
Correct.
Okay. And isn't it true that you were paid by the defense?
Well, I'm paid by the JAC, by the state, but through him.
Contracted through the defense.
Yes, sir.
How much money?
I don't know, I haven't billed him yet, but I'm approved of travel expenses and fees up to $5,000.
Okay. And you were asked to find out if Mr. Avila's DNA was present in this particular sample that is displayed here on the screen, correct?
Well, I guess I was asked to review the case and see, comment on the case, and yes, to compare him to the profiles that were in, all the profiles in this case, yes.
And the only way that your analysis works where you would actually include Mr. Avila is if you found this to be a third-party donor, a potential third donor, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. And in fact, you didn't find any sign of a third donor, correct?
No outright signs, yes, that's correct.
Okay. And in fact, if we turn to page 2, Ms. Brown wrote on the bottom that she only assumed 2 donors, correct?
There are other comments that she had made, excluding those 2, what I refer to basically as foreign peaks to Mr. Avila.
Ms. Brown on the bottom also assumed 2 donors, did she not?
On that piece of paper, yes.
So let's talk hypothetically real quick then. If we're going to assume your analysis that there's more than 2 donors in this. Actually, let's go back and talk before we do that. Let's talk about your statistical analysis. Isn't it true that back whenever we originally talked and the original information you gave Mr. Prince, you found it to be an exclusion to the point of 1 in 22 million.
Yes, sir.
And then after that, you came back, and it was actually after our deposition on May 30th that you changed that to the numbers you just gave, which was 1 in 12,000, 1 in 15,000, and 1 in 600.
That's correct.
Way less, right?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So now let's talk a hypothetical real quick. At any point did you review the E-gram results of Mr. Henry Segura?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Now, Mr. Segura's DNA at D3 contains a 1717, correct?
I'd have to look.
Okay, go ahead, look.
You say D3, 1717, correct.
Okay, and we have a 17 here, don't we?
Yes, sir.
And that 17 is a little bit higher than that 15, isn't it?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Be consistent with Mr. Segura's DNA, wouldn't it, as a minor?
Uh,
Just on that one spot. I'm just talking about D3.
Well, basically, not on that, because it's there's a ratio between the 2 peak heights. I mean, the peak heights are never equal, never the same heights. Yeah, even if you go back to the original sample, the single source sample, even you have 2 single person with 2 alleles, they're never the exact peak heights. So generally, they're within 70% of each other.
All right, well then let's turn back to your other analysis then, about third possible donors. These 2 peaks are basically the same, aren't they?
They're within like the 70%, yes.
So again, that doesn't indicate that there are more than 2 donors.
That's correct.
Okay? Let's just turn back to Mr. Segura again. Again, 1717. He's got 17 here, right?
Yes, sir.
I'm going to run through exactly like Mr. Prince did with Mr. Avila. Mr. Segura's got a 17, right?
Yes, sir.
All right, we turn to VWA, and we see a 17 and, or I'm sorry, a 15 and an 18, right?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Mr. Segura's got a 15 and an 18, right?
Yes, sir.
All right, we go to VGA. And in that particular one, we see 24, 26, 21, and 25, right?
Yes.
And Mr. Segura is at 21 and 24, so we have them both there, right?
Yes.
Okay. Obviously, Mr. Segura is male, so we have the XY.
Yes.
So next we turn to D8, and we see an 11, a 15, and a 12, correct?
Yes.
All right. And in this particular case, Mr. Avila has 12, does he not?
Yes, sir.
Mr. Avila?
I'm
Very-
sorry, Mr. Segura's got a 12.
Yes.
All right. So then we move on to D23. Oops, that's not D23, is it?
D21.
I'm sorry, D21. Can't read my own handwriting here, or my own typing. D21 has a 25 and a 28, right?
Yes.
And Mr. Avila, Mr. Segura, he's got a 28, does he not?
Yes, sir.
Move on to D18. We see a 17, a 19, and an 18.
Yes.
And Mr. Segura has got an 18 and a 19.
Correct.
We move on, and on D5 we have an 11 and an 11, and a 7 and a 12. Mr. Segura has got a 12, does he not?
Yes, sir.
On D13 we have an 11 and 11, and a 12. Mr. Segura has a 12, does he not?
Yes, sir.
I think we've already been through D3, so let's look at the next one, which is D16, I believe it is. Looks like we have a 9, a 13, and 11.
Yes, sir.
Mr. Segura has an 11 and 13, does he not?
Yes, sir.
And THO, we have a 7, we have 7, 7, and an 8 and a 9.
Yes, sir.
And Mr. Segura has a 7 and an 8.
Yes, sir.
And going to TPOX, we have an 8, 10, and a 9. Right?
Correct.
Okay, and Mr. Segura has a 9, 9.
Correct.
And then we go to CSF, and we have an 11 and 14. And Mr. Segura has an 11 and 11.
Correct.
So if you lose that situation, where there's possible dropout in this thing, or possible stacking, then we can't exclude Mr. Segura either, can we?
Well, if you look at only the foreign alleles, which is what Ms. Brown called, yes, you can.
Well, if you look at only the foreign alleles, you exclude Mr. Avila. Because Mr. Avila doesn't have that 14, does he?
Well, Ms. Brown had it documented and attributed that it possibly could be from the daughters.
Okay, but that would assume that there's got to be more than 3 donors, correct?
That's correct.
And in this particular case, I'm doing this one, she assumed 2 donors, and you found nothing in there that is inconsistent with 2 donors, and found nothing that is consistent with 3 donors, correct?
There's nothing that's documented 3 donors because of the number of peaks, but the small amount of DNA in here, I would not rule that out. And I believe Ms. Brown had documented that as well.
The only way that you can include Mr. Avila, which is what you're paid to do, is if you assume that there's more than 3 donors, and nothing in Exhibit 1A or 1B indicates that there's more than 3 donors. Is that correct? You can say it, everybody knows, it's okay.
Well, you asked a lot there. Right, as far as the documentation, no.
Redirect.
So I think it's important to explain the difference between a sample which meets criteria for clean call as a 2-donor mixture, a clean call as a 3-donor mixture, and then the gray area in between. Explain those to us.
Well, as you can see, the sample, the known sample, is really nice and pretty. Again, there's plenty of DNA and blood and semen. We get nice profiles from that. When you're talking about touch DNA, you're talking about a small amount of DNA from individuals. Some people may have a lot of DNA when they touch an object. Typically, the person who handles it more would have more DNA. If I was just to touch an object, I may put a small amount. If somebody else touches it, they put a small amount. So, for example, the phone cradle. I am sure a lot of people probably touched that. Okay. So how much DNA did they leave? You can also touch it and knock somebody else's DNA off of it. So when you're talking about touch DNA and a very low amount of DNA, then it's the experience of the analyst to look at it and say, I mean, this obviously is not clear cut, nice samples. Otherwise, I would agree that if all the peaks were up at 1,000 RFUs, I would agree it's only a 2-person, because I don't see 5 alleles. That's kind of the indication of it. It's an indication, it's not an exclusion. When you've got a small amount of DNA, and this particular sample has dropout, which means peaks you don't detect, you can see some little humps that aren't called. You use your experience as a DNA analyst to judge that. And I agreed with Ms. Brown on some of her callings that possibly one of the children could have touched some items, so she only extracted the DNA that did not belong to any family members. So I was actually going off of her data, looking at it. And she, you have to understand, the original analyst, she did not have a sample from only certain individuals, not from Mr. Avila. That's what you're supposed to do as a DNA analyst. It's called prosecution bias, but if you know the sample, you try to make it fit. I guess exactly what he's trying to do with me here. You try to make it fit. The true way is to look at the sample, not know any known samples from any individuals, except obviously victims, and say, okay, we have foreign DNA. This is from my experience, this is what I determine is going to be foreign DNA. And this will probably come from the male individual. So that's experience, that's by looking at DNA, and it's very hard to write that in a standard operating procedure. But every DNA case is reviewed by a second qualified analyst as well.
So the standard operating procedure lists specific criteria for calling something. This is what you have to be a 2-person mixture, right?
But there's always that caveat saying these are guidelines.
Right. And then there are certain minimum guidelines for it being a 3-person mixture, right?
Correct.
And there is some gray area in between where it can meet the criteria for being a clear 2-person mixture, but not have all the criteria necessary for a definite 3-person mixture, right?
Yes, sir.
Is that why both you and Ms. Brown said that it's a 2-person mixture with evidence of contribution by a 3rd?
Right, because there isn't that clear documentation.
I'm objective upon that question. I thought Ms. Brown.
Sustained. We'll let Ms. Brown speak first.
Okay. Well, let me ask you about, let's just take as an example FGA, which Mr. Fuchs talked about. Mr. Fuchs made the point that Mr. Segura is a 2124 at FGA, right?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And the 24 there belongs to the major, and the 21 belongs to the minor, correct?
Those are major and minor peaks, yes.
Right. And so if Mr. Fuchs' analysis were correct, that would necessarily mean there were a 3rd donor here, correct? Because the 21 and 24 here don't go together.
Yes, if you agree with that, yes.
If you agree with Mr. Fuchs.
Yes.
Okay. On that note, at the bottom that Mr. Fuchs pointed to about Ms. Brown saying a 2-person mixture, she didn't have the same purpose at that point as you do in trying to do statistical inclusion, correct?
That's correct.
She's merely trying to identify a partial profile that can be utilized to find investigative leads, correct?
Yes, sir.
And that's different than trying to do statistical inclusion.
Yes, sir, it is.
Okay. You said there's analyst discretion when deciding whether it's cleanly a two-person mixture or whether it's a two-person mixture without ruling out contribution by a third. Is that right?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Is part of analyst discretion taking into account or making logical assumptions based on other physical evidence and circumstantial evidence about who else's DNA might be on an object?
Yes.
Okay, and so if we know, for example, that the twins are the major contributor to the phone cord that was attached to the phone cradle that we're looking at here, is that a piece of information that could aid in understanding or assuming that their DNA might be in the mixture we got from the cradle?
I would say you could assume that.
Okay, is that what Joel and Brown did here?
Objection, Your Honor, speculation.
Based on the reports that you reviewed and testimony you reviewed, is that the basis of not using the 14, for example, at VWA as part of her analysis, not considering the 14 to be a foreign allele?
Yes, sir, I did see documentation of that.
And is that the same analytical process that you used?
Yes, sir.
I have no further questions at this
The
time.
juror have a question of this witness? All right, we'll go sidebar. I have a couple of follow-up questions from the jury. And if you didn't look for this, just tell us that. But the question is, did you find Brandi Peters' DNA present in the mixed samples that we were looking at?
Yes, I did.
What about as to her son, Javante Segura? Did you find his DNA present in the mixture?
Not in the foreign alleles, no, sir.
Or did you find it somewhere else?
No.
When there's a DNA sample with a mother and her child involved, would you frequently expect to find masking because the DNA of a mother and child would be similar or the same at the loci?
Yes, a mother and child are going to share at least, they're going to share one allele. The mother did give the child one of her alleles, so you would have one allele definitely in common.
And you would expect to have what they call masking. Is that the right terminology?
Yes, sir. Sharing and masking, yes.
All right. If an allele is masked, is the peak expected to be higher?
Yes, sir.
Follow up, Mr. Prince?
There you are.
Follow up, Mr. Fuchs?
There you are.
All right, you can step down. Do we need to keep Mr. Knopfinger further?
We'll keep him under speeding under the rule. He can go about his business now.
All right, you'll be on call. Call your next witness.
The defense will call John Sawicki.
Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony given in this case will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Slide a microphone closer. May proceed.
Mr. Sawicki, can you please introduce yourself to the jury, spelling in your first and last name for the court reporter?
John Sawicki, John Sawicki.
And what do you do for a living?
I'm a electronic evidence consultant and forensic computer scientist.
What exactly does that mean?
Essentially what it means is I examine electronic evidence, whether it be in a device such as a computer or a cell phone, or in the form of cell phone records, and interpret that and prepare for court cases.
Okay. Tell us a little bit about your educational background.
Sure, I've got an undergraduate degree from George Fox University, business, a law degree from Florida State University. I've got a graduate certificate in computer forensics from the University of Central Florida. I've got a master's degree in digital forensics from the University of Central Florida.
Okay. Do you maintain bar admissions, or are you admitted to bars in different states?
I'm admitted in both Florida and Oregon.
Do you hold any professional licenses?
I don't at this point, no.
Okay. Do you, can you tell us a little bit about your professional experience, both as a law enforcement officer, lawyer, and a forensic computer scientist?
Sure. I spent 9 years with the Douglas County, Oregon Sheriff's Office. About 2004, I left to go to law school, moved to Florida. Spent about 8 years practicing mostly labor and employment litigation. During the course of that, had cases come up that involved electronic evidence, and so I started attending the classes at the University of Central Florida. Obtained both the graduate certificate and the master's degree in digital forensics.
Okay. Tell me a little bit about the specific training courses you've attended relative to technology and forensics.
Probably got about 400 hours of training in general areas of computer and cell phone forensics. In addition to, and those are mostly courses put on by private companies that would train police officers, other corporate representatives who engage in computer and cell phone forensics work. In addition to that, I probably get another 200 hours of training in radio frequency propagation, how cell tower networks operate, how cell phones operate.
Have you ever written a peer-reviewed article or presented to folks regarding the topics about which we're discussing here?
As far as peer-reviewed articles, I don't believe so. I've published articles in legal journals. I have presented regularly in Florida and Georgia in the areas of electronic evidence, in the areas of cell tower analysis, both to lawyers and judges as well.
Have you ever testified as an expert in state or federal court on these issues?
Probably about 35 times.
Okay. How many times have you worked as a cell technology expert consultant without actually having testified on the case?
At this point, I've probably handled somewhere in the neighborhood of 200 or so cell tower analysis cases.
Okay. At this point, Your Honor, I would tend to the witness.
Any board ire?
No, Your Honor.
All right, you may proceed.
Did you have an opportunity to review both the cell phone data, the RTT data, and text data for the different handsets and accounts obtained by law enforcement in this case?
I did.
Did you also have an opportunity to review the information relative to the experiment that TPD conducted using the dummy phone?
I did.
Okay. In the general sense first, tell me how accurate distance from tower data tends to be.
The concept behind distance from tower data is essentially we know how fast the signal is traveling. So if you know how long it takes to get from point A to point B, you can assess what that distance is. And in theory, it's pretty sound theory. I heard the theory the other day that, or the analogy the other day, that if you were traveling 60 miles in 1 hour, you're traveling 60 miles an hour. And that's a great analogy until you have to stop for gas, or somebody has to stop to use the bathroom. All of a sudden, that kind of throws a wrench into the whole thing. In terms of RTT data, the signal travels from the tower to the handset, and then has to wait for an acknowledgement from the handset itself. Now, you've got latency from the handset involved to where it's not necessarily a perfect turnaround. You have some other issues that become involved in terms of multipathing, which means that radio frequencies don't necessarily travel directly from one point to another, particularly when there are obstructions in the way. You get reflection and refraction involved, and all of that can impact how that works. Now, what we've seen, particularly in the test that the Tallahassee Police Department did, is you get some varying degrees of reliability as to how accurate that actually is in practice. I mean, for example, the RTT data that they received, in none of those instances is it ever accurate. It's always inaccurate. It's just a matter of to what degree. I believe in about, we had 60 events. Those are voice calls, text messages, data transmissions within the test that TPD did, where I could tell from the report exactly where the individual using the phone was standing. And within those 60 events, I believe about 88% of them were inaccurate by more than 1/10 of a mile. It's a fairly significant inaccuracy.
Okay. Regarding the general methodology utilized for that test, the experiment, rather, the TPD did, are there any practical or methodology problems that you identify?
The test was, I believe, designed to essentially try to see if they're going to get the same results they had seen out of the phones that were involved in this case, and whether or not that they responded accordingly. And I don't know if it was actually a true validation attempt or not, but if you're going to truly attempt to validate those tests, you probably need more than just the limited number of phone calls that we had in the test case, as well as to stretch those out over a longer period of time. For example, one of the towers that has been incredibly important in this case is Tower 847, Sector 1. I'm sure you guys heard that yesterday. You'll probably hear it again today. In the test case, there were only just a very few number of calls that hit that sector from at the victim's residence. That makes it hard to tell whether the results that you're getting are actually validating what you had previously seen, or is it just happens that this is the one point in time where it happens to match up, and it's hard to say.
Okay. What is the problem with doing all of the tests in a short period of time, exactly?
Well, the cellular networks are impacted by a large number of things, and it can include things such as the traffic on the tower. It can include the weather that happens to be at that particular time, a number of other factors that can vary depending on the time of day. Obviously, network traffic is probably higher in the evenings than it is in the middle of the night. Some of those issues that it's really tough to go back and exactly reproduce the network conditions that were in place at that particular time. And one test probably isn't going to tell you whether or not you've actually achieved that, or one limited period of time probably isn't going to tell you whether you've truly achieved that.
Okay. Is it the same general type of problem when you're talking about the number of instances of communication they did for each location? For example, the victim's house, you're talking about 9 communications of different types.
9 communications over a very short period of time. I think we're talking 6 or 8 minutes, something like that. So it's if I was going to design a test truly designed to validate those results, I would stretch it out over days, weeks, and potentially even months, and a significant number of calls in which you could determine whether or not the results you're seeing are actually valid.
What about the averaging method used for determining error range? Is there any issue with using averages to determine error range? Averaging
is a problem. One of the things that it does is it buries significantly incorrect data. I've heard them referred to as flyers. The problem is if you're trying to truly develop an error range, you can't simply discard those flyers. That's actually part of your error. It's built into it. The biggest issue with it is if you were to take 3 results, one of them is 100 miles, one of them is 200 miles, and one of them is 300 miles. When your true distance is 200 miles and you average those together, you're going to get an average error of 0 distance, because they cancel each other out. When in reality, 2 out of your 3 results were wrong by 100 miles.
Okay. And as it relates to the particular communications that the Tallahassee Police Department engaged in or conducted during their investigation, in calculating the average, explain exactly how the averaging problem translated to, if I understand you correctly, an incorrect understanding of the actual error range.
I think what happens by averaging that is you get some significantly incorrect data, that's wrong by a half a mile or more. That compresses that error range that gets washed out by the other results that you have.
Okay. And just to be clear, in case it's not, you don't think that, the cell data is going to show that you're communicating under normal circumstances with one tower or one sector when you're not, correct?
That's correct.
And the RTT data is generally accurate, just not pinpoint accurate. Is that a fair summary?
That's fair.
Okay. But in calculating the actual error range, what's the correct process to go through?
It's tough to develop a true process for doing this, but you have to do something that's actually going to take into account the impact that those extreme inaccuracies are going to show. And particularly when you're going to relate it to one specific call in time, such as when you're trying to build a timeline. Is somebody still at a location? Are they no longer at a location? You have to, particularly at that point, take into account those extreme inaccuracies, and I think you have to look to those maximum errors as a way of looking at one point in time and saying, is this actually true, or how far off could it really be based on what we know about how that tower reacts, even in a small sample.
Did you go through the process using the data available to attempt to calculate a more accurate error range for the communications at issue in this case?
I didn't so much as attempt to calculate a more correct error range as adopt the error range that Sergeant Corbett had mentioned yesterday when he testified.
Okay. So even using Sergeant Corbett's data, you were able to analyze possible error range within the sector of the different towers that the phones at issue in this case were communicating with?
That's correct.
Okay. And in analyzing that data, did you develop some visual aids to assist you in explaining your testimony to the jury?
I did.
May I approach the witness, Your Honor?
You know,
The record reflect and showing the witness what's been marked for identification as defensive composite exhibit 5.
are they individually marked?
They're not, but I will mark them.
All right, they need to be, how many sheets are we talking about?
I believe there's 24, Your Honor.
Right, so we need to have A through, whatever that would be, Madam Clerk.
Is that a true and accurate copy of the visual aids that you developed in analyzing the cell data in this case?
That may actually be the copies I printed myself.
Okay. And they do accurately reflect the cell phone data that you reviewed relative to the handsets and accounts for this case?
Yes, they do.
Okay. Do you have your copy of those?
I've got them electronically.
You've got them electronically. Maybe it'd just be easier to have me put these on the projectors one by one.
I think it probably would be.
Okay, let's do that. All right, so we'll call this first one, which is a communication from the defendant's 408 number at 134108, 14108 on November 19th. We'll call this 1A. I'm sorry, 5A. Yes, sir. What are we looking at here?
This shows the dark line that runs through the middle shows the, if you could slide that down just for a second so I can see the legend. It's in the upper left-hand corner. There you go. This shows the mapping of a call that took place at 1:41:08. I'm sorry, correct, 1:41:08 p.m. using Tower 847, Sector 1. What that showed was a distance from tower number of 0.95 miles. And if you look in the center, That's the dark line that cuts right through the middle of that sector. That's 0.95 miles.
Okay, so for that particular communication, we see the victim's house. Her house is within the average error range used by Sergeant Corbett.
It's very close to the edge, but yes, it is.
And likewise, what's the 401 Gale Avenue address?
401 Gale, as I understand it, is Mr. Segura's sister's residence.
Okay, so both locations are within the average error range utilized by Sergeant Corbett.
That's correct.
Okay, and what is the broader band that we see there?
Let me actually specify that. There is a slightly darker blue band that runs through the middle of that actually reflects an error range of plus or minus 0.2 miles. Unfortunately, it doesn't translate real well to the overhead, but the larger overall band is the error range of 0.95 miles plus or minus 0.61 miles.
Okay, what about the next communication, 13?
I'm sorry, can we approach, please?
I may have stated the time wrong, 1:41, I think is the time we're talking about. You may proceed.
So we had finished talking about the 141 or 1341 communication. Let's look now at the next one in sequence, 154 and 41 seconds.
That's correct.
And for the record, this will be 5B. What are we looking at here?
This is the next event that occurs on the RTT data.
And again, this is for the same phone, the defendant 408 phone.
Exactly.
Okay.
And again, this shows that error range of plus or minus 0.2 miles and the error range of plus or minus 0.61 miles on a distance from tower reading of 1.06 miles.
Okay. And both locations are within the error range for that communication as well.
I can't tell for certain about the 40. Oh, they're both within the overall error range. That's correct. Within the.
And it looks like it's pretty close on the average.
It's
Can't tell.
fairly close on the 401 Gale Avenue. It's within just a few hundred feet.
Okay. What about the next communication? 14:12:48 to 12 p.m.
Again, we have the same error ranges, this time on a distance to tower reading of 1.03 miles. This again has the Gale Avenue address within the overall error range and within the averaged error range as well.
Okay. And how about the 14:13:37 communication, which will be 5C?
I think D.
Again, we're dealing with a call this time at, or, I'm sorry, it's a, I don't recall that looking at the RTG report, whether it's a call, a data event, or an SMS message, but it's an event that occurs at 2:13:37 using tower 847 sector 1, and I believe that's at a distance of 0.95 miles.
Okay. And are both within the average error range there?
Yes, they are.
And certainly both within the total error range as well, correct?
That's correct.
Next one will be 5E for 2:20 p.m. What do we see with respect to this communication?
Another event occurring at 2:20 p.m. Using 847 sector 1, and this is at a distance of 1.06 miles.
Okay. Still only sector 1. All of these are only sector 1, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. And both within the total error range there?
Correct.
And I can't tell with respect to the bottom address there, is that within the average error range as well?
I believe it's a few hundred feet outside, probably close enough that I would have a tough time arguing against it.
Okay. The next one. I'm sorry, this communication takes place at 14:27:51.
That's correct. This is another event on the same tower, on the same sector. I believe this is at a distance to tower reading of 0.93 miles.
Okay. And 401 Yale Avenue is within the average error range for this communication.
That's correct.
And I can't tell whether the 908, is that within the average error range?
I believe it's right on the edge of it.
Same as kind of what you described before, a few hundred meters within the average.
I would say it's less than a few hundred meters. It's a few hundred feet.
Few hundred feet, okay, all right. And for reference, that was 5F. Let's look at 5G. Is that 15:05 to 3:05 in the afternoon? What do we see with respect to this communication?
Again, this is at 3:05 p.m., same sector on the same tower. Distance to tower reading of 1.04 miles. In this case, you see 401 Gale, I believe, is just slightly outside of the average error range, but both of them are contained within the overall error range.
Next, looking at 5H, takes place at 15:58, 3:58 p.m. What are we looking at there?
This is another event occurring at 3:58 p.m. using the same sector and tower. I believe that is that 0.98 miles? I can't read it.
Yeah, 0.98.
Okay. 0.98 miles, and we're going to see both of the locations within that average error range.
So for 5I, communication takes place at 5 p.m. to 1700 p.m. 1700 hours.
Again, we've got the same sector and tower. It's an event that occurs at just almost a minute after 5 at a distance to tower reading of 1.11 miles.
Okay, and it looks like now by this time the 401 Yale Avenue is outside the average, still inside the total error range, but outside the average. Is that right?
That's correct.
Okay. Looking at 5J, communication at 5:45 p.m. What do we see with this communication?
This is actually an event that occurs on the first different tower that we've seen during this exhibit. This occurs on 849 Sector 1 at a distance to tower reading of 2.54 miles. In this case, we had a slightly different maximum error range. I believe in this case, if I could refer to my notes for just a second.
Sure.
In this case, we've got a maximum error range of 1.25 miles.
So that's the total blue area we see on there, the total blue arc?
That's correct.
Okay. What's the average error range for that communication?
I don't have the average error range for that tower, which is why it hasn't been plotted.
Okay, all right. For 5K, we have a communication that takes place at 6:01 p.m. at 1800. Is this also on Tower 849?
This is not. This is on Tower 851, Sector 1, at a distance to tower rating of 3.98 miles. This tower has a slightly different maximum error rating of 1.61 miles, which is what you see plotted there.
And both locations appear to be at the basically at the edge of the maximum error range on that communication, correct?
That's true.
Okay. Five L. This is at 6:05 p.m., correct?
That's correct. We're back on Tower 847, Sector 1, at a distance to tower reading of 1.08 miles. Again, this has the 0.2 mile average error range and the 0.61 mile maximum error range.
And at this point, the 401 Gale is outside the average error range, correct?
That's correct.
It doesn't look like too much farther than before, but still outside the average error range.
That's true.
Okay. Still within the total error range stuff?
Yes, sir.
Next is 5M. This is at 6:07 p.m. Which tower is this one at?
This is on Tower 849, Sector 1, at a distance to tower reading of 2.52 miles.
All right, and both clearly within the error range, both addresses clearly within the error range for that communication?
Yes, sir.
And 5N, a communication taking place at 6:10 p.m. Is on Tower 849 as well?
Yes, sir. At a distance to tower reading of 2.51 miles. And again, you'll see both locations grouped very close to the distance to tower rating itself.
With respect to 5O, this is communication at 6:19 p.m. What do we see with this communication?
We're back on Tower 847, Sector 1, at a distance to tower reading of 1.05 miles.
Okay. And the sister's address is slightly outside the average error range for that one, right?
That's correct.
Okay. Victim's house is within the average error range,
Yes, sir.
and both are within the total error range?
Yes, sir.
P, communication at 6:20 p.m. Basically the same as the last communication, right?
It is with a slightly longer distance to tower reading of 1.07 miles.
Okay. So the sister's house is slightly farther outside the average error range on that one.
That's correct, but still both are within the overall error range.
Okay. 5Q. What do we see on 5Q at 6:25 p.m.?
Again, we're on the same tower in Sector 847, Sector 1, and this has a distance to tower rating identical to the last.
Okay, again, the sister's address is slightly outside the average error range, correct?
Yes, sir.
Within the broader error range, the total error range.
That's correct.
Okay. 5R, communication at 6:33 p.m. Basically the same as the last several, correct?
It is, this time with a slightly shorter distance to tower reading of 1.06 miles.
And again, the sister's address outside the error range for the communication.
Outside the average error range.
We have 5S. This is communication at 7:23 p.m. What do we have going on with this one?
Again, we're still on 847, Sector 1. This is a distance to tower reading of 1.66 miles.
Okay. And the victim's house is barely within the total error range there, right? But still within it.
Correct.
And the sister's house is outside of the total possible error range.
It is.
at 1820, the 5T. Where we have it here?
Go back one. Did we get the times messed up?
I think we did, yes, sir.
We get out of order
I
there.
think we did. This
Just
one
wanted
must
to
be
make
out
sure
of
my
order.
notes were correct. We had 723 on the previous one.
We did.
On S was 723.
Yes,
Okay.
Is this, Mr. Ricky, is this a duplicate or is it just out of order, the 182045?
We'd have to check and see if there's an 182045 in there.
Okay.
There is a 620 already marked as
That's
letter
duplicate.
P.
So that one's a duplicate, so that will be stricken as 5T, and I'll use a different 5T.
What's that?
We already have an 182045 in here, so I'll strike that as 5T and make a different communication 5T.
Okay.
So we have 5S here at 1923. That was the one we just talked about.
That was S is 723, right?
Yes, it's 723, yes, sir.
Okay.
Where we have the sister's house outside.
Now, we've already talked about that.
5T is at 737. Where we have at 737.
737 is on 847, Sector 1, at a distance of 1.06 miles.
Okay, and again, here we have the victim's house within the average error range. That's like the sister's house is outside the average error range, right?
That's slightly outside, yes, sir.
5U. This is at 8:21 p.m. Both the victim's house and the sister's house appear to be outside of the average error range. Is that right?
The victim's house is right on the edge, but yes, that's correct.
Okay. What, if anything, does that indicate?
As far as
Location.
well, it's on the edge of the sector, if that's what you're referring to.
The victim's house is on the edge of the, oh, you mean the phone is on the edge of the sector. Or you clarify for me, when you said it's on the edge of the sector, what are you talking about?
The victim's residence is on the edge of the sector. I don't think that, well, the sister's house is near the edge of the maximum error range. The victim's house is near the edge of the average error range. I think it's tough to exclude either one of those based on this data alone.
The center point, kind of the center line where this communication essentially runs right down Paul the road, right?
Yes, sir.
Which is the road to get back to Woodville Highway,
That's correct.
which is the road back to the defendant's house.
Yes, sir.
Are all of the communications after 8:21 back down in the area of the defendant's house?
They are.
So there's no more communications that night at all anywhere near the victim's house?
No, not near the victim's house.
Okay. In reviewing the records in this case, did you have an opportunity to
So is there
review?
going to be a V and a W?
There are, Your Honor. Yes, sir.
Okay,
But they relate to
okay.
something else here. In reviewing the records in this case, in addition to the records for the defendant and the victim, did you also have an opportunity to review the phone records of Haywood Griffin?
I did.
May I approach the witness, Your Honor? Mark for identification is defense for. Do you recognize that?
I do.
Is that a true and accurate copy of Mr. Griffin's phone records for the night of November 19th?
It appears consistent with what I was provided.
Okay. And with those records, because they were obtained later, there is no distance without that, no RTC data, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. This time I move in evidence what's been pre-marked for identification only as defense 4 in as defense 4.
Defense exhibit what?
4, Your Honor.
So we had 5, and we're going back to 4, is that right? Okay. probably about due for a break if you're on a stopping point, Mr. Prince. We've been going a little over an hour. This is a little tedious to go through. All right, y'all ready to take 10 minutes? Let's stay in session for a second with the attorney. All right, Mr. Prince, you may proceed. Everybody be seated, please.
Thank you, Your Honor. Mr. Sawicki, we just introduced Haywood Griffin's records. Did you review those records and analyze his call data and tower data for the night of the 19th and early morning hours of the 20th as well?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And what towers was his phone communicating with during that time frame?
His phone was connecting with Sector 2 on Tower 232 and Sector 1 on Tower 157.
Let's talk first about Tower 157, Sector 1. This is 5V.
V is in Victor.
Yes, sir. So this is Tower 157 down here.
Yes, sir.
Okay. And the purple cone, does that indicate the edge of the purple cone? Right here. Does that indicate the edge of the tower range, or are you just showing directionality with the purple?
No, that's
Could you slide that up on the screen just a little
Yes,
bit,
sir.
Mr. Prince? I think maybe we could lose it, yeah, but we're losing a little.
that's solely designed to show the direction of transmission from the tower.
Okay. And you have any way of knowing under the network conditions present on that day what the range was?
No, without going out and actually measuring it, I don't think it's possible to know.
Okay, so if the only information you had was that he's communicating with Sector 1 of Tower 157, it would just be in this sort of easterly, northeasterly direction, correct?
That's correct.
And it could technically go out past the edge of that purple cone while still communicating with that tower.
I think it's entirely likely that it does go out past that point.
Okay. And to be clear, the victim's house is within that sector, within range of that tower in that sector.
The victim's house is in a direction consistent with the transmission of that tower.
Okay. And then finally, with respect to 5W, you said there was another tower with which Mr. Griffin's phone was communicating, and that was Tower 232, Sector 2, is that right?
That's correct.
Okay. This is a tower that's farther north from Tower 157,
Yes, it is.
and the sector of the tower is facing south, is that correct?
That's correct.
So both towers are pointing in kind of an easterly direction. The one is north, one is south, the one is south, all pointing north. Is that right?
That's correct.
Okay. Is the victim's house within range of 232 as well?
Again, I can't tell you what the range of the tower is without actually having measurements for that date and time. However, it is in a direction that is consistent with the transmission of the tower.
Under normal network conditions, would you expect a handset located at the victim's house to be able to easily communicate with Sector 2 of Tower 232?
Again, I don't know the range of the tower, so I can't tell you that for sure, but I can't exclude it from that tower.
Okay. Are there any other Sprint towers in a directional angle from the victim's house that would intercept that?
I don't,
Let me ask this question to make it clear. Normally, a handset will try to communicate first with the closest tower to it, correct? Or rather, the strongest signal. That's right.
the strongest signal, the cleanest signal, that's correct.
And a lot of times, strongest signal correlates to physical distance, correct?
It can.
Okay. And so the two towers that were communicating with Mr. Griffin's phone all throughout the night of the 19th, early morning hours of the 20th, are two towers in close proximity to the victim's home.
Not just in close proximity, but both of those towers are pointed in the correct direction.
Okay. At this point, I would move into evidence. What's been pre-marked for identification is Defense Composite Exhibit 5A through W. Into evidence is Defense Composite Exhibit 5A through W.
I thought we'd already admitted it truthfully, but
Oh.
is the state objecting?
No, no.
Right, so clarify, there is no X.
The last thing that I want to ask you about, Mr. Sawicki, is the victim's RTT data, basically between 5 p.m. and 8:21 p.m. Okay? During the time when everybody agrees the victim is at her house, let's say 5 to 7 p.m., is that distance from tower data consistent with the last reported distance from tower? Is it a similar sort of variance between actual distance and reported distance?
He may have understood that question, but I didn't, so we might have a problem with the jury understanding it. Mr.
Yes, sir.
Prince. Maybe we'd start over again.
Let me clarify. Did you look at the victim's handset distance from tower data for the night of the 19th?
I did, just as clarification, it's not an RTT report in this case because it's a different carrier. It's a PCMD, per call measurement data report, which contains similar characteristics, including the tower distancing information. And yes, I did review that.
Okay. And the variance between reported data, reported distance and actual distance for the calls between 5 p.m., is that the same sort of variance between reported distance and actual distance that we see at 8:21 p.m., the last communication from her phone? Basically, what I'm asking you is the last call, the same sort of variance consistent with the RT or the distance from tower data for the earlier calls as well?
The last event that I see PCM data showing distance to tower
Right.
information for on her phone is at 7:49, and that's actually a data transmission. It shows 1.14 miles.
Okay, and that 1.14, is that consistent with all the other readings we're getting from her phone during that time and prior to that?
During the time period you described, it's fairly similar. They are kind of all over the place, so it isn't we're more than, just a few hundredths of a mile off.
Okay, no further questions.
Cross.
Yes, Your Honor. Mr. Sawicki, let's first turn and take a look at you talked about your analysis of Mr. Hayward Griffith. Photograph 5V as in Victor. Where's Mr. Griffin's house in this?
I don't know.
So you analyzed Mr. Griffin's house, Mr. Griffin's cell phone data, and did all the comparisons as it relates to the victim's house, but you never once looked at, and looking at the data, where Mr. Griffin actually lived.
I've never been provided with his residence address.
Now, Mr. Sawicki, if I were to tell you that his address is at 2929 Mock Drive, do you know where that is?
I don't, but I could certainly look it up.
Okay, go ahead and look it up.
Is that Mock, M-O-C-K?
M-O-C-K.
2929, is that what you said, Mr. Peeper?
Yes, sir. Mock Drive.
It's up in this area up in here.
Right there, isn't it?
Yep,
Right in the middle of your cone, correct?
that's true.
Okay. And again, let's take a look at 5W. Again, can you point it
That's in this area here.
right there, right?
Yes, sir.
So that one's consistent actually with distancing and things along those lines, and we'll get to that in a second, but it's obviously much closer to this 232, right? It's almost even halfway between that 232 tower and the one at 157, is it not?
I don't quite understand the question.
His house is almost halfway in between the two, is it not?
It's probably pretty close.
Okay. Which would be a pretty good indicator about why it is that it's bouncing off of two different towers, is because he's sitting in his living room using his phone, which is halfway in between these two.
It could be.
Okay. And in fact, when you look further at Mr. Griffin's phone records during that time period, we have numerous incoming calls, numerous outgoing calls. There are time periods of a minute, or 116 seconds, 175 seconds, 850 seconds, pretty much all throughout the evening until midnight when it stops being utilized, correct?
True.
Okay. Once again, consistent with Mr. Griffin sitting in his living room using his phone.
He could be.
Now, I noticed in talking about Mr. Corbett's analysis and looking through all the photographs that we looked at, which would be 5A through U, it didn't appear that any of these photographs were inconsistent with what Mr. Corbett testified to, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. And in fact, your criticism of Mr. Corbett's analysis essentially was that his use of averages, right?
That was one of the issues, correct.
Okay. But Mr. Corbett, you were here for his testimony. During the course of his testimony, he never discussed averages essentially when he showed all the stuff up there, did he? He just simply showed the raw data, did he not?
True.
Okay. Yet your entire testimony talked about averages, did it not?
That's true.
So what doesn't work for Mr. Corbett actually works for you.
I don't think it really works real well either way.
Okay. Let's talk about these lines that you utilized here. These are not hard and fast lines, are they?
That's true.
Okay. These are actually, even on the edge here, it actually is a little fuzzy over here, and of course that goes on forever. And a little fuzzy over there, right?
Correct.
Okay. And isn't it true that you previously actually testified in Tampa, Florida, and criticized a state witness for utilizing hard and fast lines like this?
I think we're talking about a slightly different type of analysis there, where he was limiting his range to the hard and fast lines.
Okay. But you're talking about, did you not just testify that 908 Saddle Creek Drive, or Saddle Creek Run, is on the very edge of that cone that you just talked about? Repeatedly, in showing these particular photographs right here, you talked repeatedly about how that's right on the edge, did you not?
It is. However, I would not preclude it from being from either side of that sector, from either sector serving that
Okay, fair enough.
residence.
Fair enough. So let's take a look at these photographs, or these images that you do have. Were you provided the address for Mr. Segura?
Yes, I was.
Okay, and where was that address?
It's to the south several miles.
Okay, 1098 Mustang Drive?
Yes, sir.
Okay. You would agree that this phone that Mr. Segura is utilizing is not consistent with him being at his home as he told law enforcement, correct?
I would.
That's photograph A. Photograph B at 154, you would agree that this is not consistent with him being at his home as the day that he told law enforcement, correct?
I would agree.
Photograph C at 212, not consistent with him being at his home as he told law enforcement, correct?
Correct.
213 is not consistent with him being at his home as he told law enforcement, correct?
Correct.
220, this is not consistent with him being at his home as he told law enforcement, correct?
Correct.
227, this is not consistent with him being at his home as he told law enforcement, correct?
Correct.
305, this is not consistent with him being at his home as he told law enforcement, correct?
Correct.
358, this is not consistent with him being at his home as he told law enforcement, is it?
It is not.
5 o'clock, this is not consistent with him being at his home as he told law enforcement, correct?
Correct.
5:45, this is not consistent with him being at home as he told law enforcement, correct?
Correct.
6:01, this is not consistent with him being told that what he told law enforcement about being at his home, correct?
Correct.
605, this is not consistent with what he told law enforcement of being at home, correct?
That's true.
607, this is not consistent with what he told law enforcement about being at his home, correct?
Correct.
610, this is not consistent with what he told law enforcement about being at his home, correct?
Correct.
619, this is not consistent with what he told law enforcement about being at his home all day, correct?
Correct.
620, this is not consistent with what he told law enforcement about being at his home, correct?
Correct.
625, this is not consistent with what he told law enforcement about being at his home, correct?
Correct.
633, this is not consistent about what he told law enforcement about being at his home, correct?
Correct.
723, this is not consistent with what he told law enforcement about being home all day, correct?
Correct.
737, this is not consistent with what he told law enforcement about being home all day, correct?
Correct.
And 821, this is not consistent with what he told law enforcement about being home all day, correct?
Correct.
Redirect. Very briefly.
In viewing Mr. Griffin's records, there are periods of inactivity for his phone, just as there are for Mr. Segura's phone during the evening hours of November 19th and the early morning hours of November 20th, correct?
Correct.
In fact, his phone is inactive for a huge amount of time all throughout the night, just like Mr. Segura's phones were, correct?
That's correct.
No further questions.
All right, any juror have a question of this witness? All right, if not, you may step down. All right, next witness.
Our next witness will take about 2.5, 3 hours. I would
What's that?
Our next witness will take about 2.5, 3 hours. I didn't know if you want to go do him tomorrow. We're still on track to finish the defense case in chief tomorrow. Or do you want me to
Just soon get half an hour in or so.
Okay.
Anybody in a rush to go? I figure we at least, work up till 5 o'clock or so.
Okay.
Let's
At this time, the defense will call Michael Knox.
Why don't you shoot for somewhere in the half-hour range or so?
Yes, sir.
When you come to a logical stopping point and that.
Yes, sir.
Come on up here, please. You face the clerk and be sworn.
Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you give in this case will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Have a seat. Slide up the microphone, please.
All right, thank you.
Mr. Knox, can you please introduce yourself to the jury, spelling your first and last name for the court reporter?
Certainly. My name is Michael Knox, and that's Knox.
What do you do for a living?
I'm a forensic consultant. I do crime scene reconstruction, shooting reconstruction mostly.
Tell the jury exactly what that consists of.
Well, what we do is take mostly physical evidence in cases, and then we evaluate it, and then kind of assemble the pieces, figure out what happened when a crime took place.
All right. Can you tell the jury, to start with, a little bit about your education?
I've got I've peer-reviewed technical papers through the American Society of Mechanical Engineers at a conference over the course of about 4 different years, where I did papers like on reconstructing shooting incidents, using fired cartridge case patterns, using things like reconstructing accidental discharges where a firearm gets dropped and it causes it to go off, reconstructing long-range shootings where you have to start to account for more than just a straight flight path. You have to account for the curved flight path, things like that.
Okay. And what about books and book contributions? Do you have any of those?
Well, I have, there's an associate that works with me that he actually wrote a book on crime scene processing, and then eventually we converted it into a multimedia training DVD that is made to basically teach crime scene investigators the A to Z's, be sort of a reference of how you would go about processing a crime scene. And so when we converted that, then I contributed to some of that, added a chapter and contributed to some of the other chapters, and then of course we assembled it into a digital format.
Okay. Do you hold any professional accreditations or certifications?
I do. I am board certified by the International Association for Identification as a crime scene reconstructionist.
Have you ever been qualified to testify as an expert regarding all of the issues you've just discussed previously?
I have in many cases, yes.
Do you have any idea how many?
Probably courtroom testimony as an expert in those areas, probably at least maybe 60, 70 times, something like that.
And would you have an idea of how many more you've consulted on as an expert on the same topics?
Hundreds of cases.
Okay. This time I would tender the witness.
Wish to word out. Your Honor, I'm not entirely sure what field we're actually tendering at, so I think I'd like some clarification as to what we're tendering at.
Mr. Knox, do you have specific training and experience evaluating blood spatter analysis?
I do, yes.
Do you have specific training and experience with respect to wound interpretation?
Yes.
Do you have specific training and experience as it relates to firearm analysis?
Yes.
Do you have specific training and experience as it relates to latent processing?
Yes.
Do you have specific training and experience as it relates to DNA collection?
Yes.
Do you have specific training and experience as it relates to shoe impression, collection, and interpretation?
Yes.
This time I would tender the witness in each of those areas.
Your Honor, may I have a question?
Amen.
As to, I'm not trying to be hard, I'm not 100% sure. As to blood spatter analysis, what training and experience specifically do you have towards the blood spatter analysis?
Training, I've been to 2 different 40-hour courses, one being the bloodstain pattern analysis, or what's often called the wet workshop. It's the first training where you actually do a lot of experiments with blood and things like that. Then I've also done the advanced course, which is more of an instructor sets it up. You have to do analysis and things like that. Also, when I got my master's degree, one of the courses that I took for that was blood distribution and spatter, so a graduate course in that area. And experience-wise, from all the crime scenes, and I've done analysis on numerous crime scenes, both as a crime scene investigator and then as a private consultant.
Okay. What about wound interpretation?
I've had one of my graduate coursework classes was forensic medicine, so there we're dealing with all different aspects of wounds and the types of things that you'd see in an autopsy, that you'd see in a criminal case. And then, of course, I've done a lot of analysis, pretty much just about every case we do, whether it's a shooting or something else, you've got some aspect of wound dynamics where you're looking at either wound patterns, looking at patterns and matching those to a particular object, or including or excluding possible objects. Also looking at things like, gunshot wound dynamics as far as how the gunshots occur, what's the angle into the body, and how does that relate to positioning that a person was in, where is a shooter relative to that person, things like that.
So when you're saying interpretation, you're talking about as it relates on the crime scene. You're not talking about medical doctor or cutting it open and figuring the depths of the injury and things along those lines and how they affect the human body.
That's right. I would be looking more at things like pattern injuries and stuff as opposed to the more medical side of it. Not looking at injuries as far as what would be the medical outcome of them or anything like that.
Okay. As it relates to your firearm analysis, I know you talked about long-range shooting and, of course, the drops and things like that of firearms. Again, is your training experience as it relates to the interpretation as it relates to a crime scene, or do you have more of the microscopic level of analysis, such as where the firearm came from as far as matching it to other firearms?
No, in terms of identification work, I don't do that. So in other words, looking at one bullet, looking at another bullet and matching whether or not they were fired by the same gun, no, that area I don't do. With firearms, I do a lot of other stuff, trajectory reconstruction, dealing with firearms itself and whether or not there's an issue with the firearm or malfunction or things like that, as well as looking at the evidence on the firearm that could indicate anything about how it was fired or what took place in the shooting, things like that.
Okay. Correct me if I'm wrong, but how it was fired, and that can be a couple of different interpretations, so I want to make sure we get it right about what we're talking about here. How it was fired can be on a microscopic level, and we're talking about imprints of shell casings and things along those lines, and tool marks as it's ejected, things along those lines, versus how it was fired as in locational wise and reconstructing the crime scene. What are we talking about with your experience?
The latter, that I would be doing more of where was the firearm, how was it held, how was it used, what's the distance from the target that was shot at, or things like that, as opposed to when you're talking about looking at it under the microscope and identifying things like the minutia on the fired cartridge cases or on fired bullets to match them to other bullets or cartridge cases or things like that. That's not what I do, but okay. I do the crime scene aspect of it.
Latent prints, I'm just trying to run through the ones that I heard you say. Latent prints, processing, are you talking about the actual processing on the crime scene, or are you talking about the matching?
Processing on the crime scene.
Okay. Same with shoe impressions, same thing?
Same thing, yes.
Okay. Processing on scene, not the matching aspects.
That would be correct.
Yeah, no problem with the witness, thank you.
You can proceed, Mr. Payne.
Just to clarify, with respect to shoe impressions, as part of your crime scene reconstruction, you'll look at and compare different shoe impressions, look at directionality of the shoe impressions and things like that.
That's right. I would not do a unique identification. In other words, I wouldn't look at one shoe impression and then match it to a shoe, and that would be a footwear impression expert who would specifically do that. But in terms of looking at footwear impressions and saying, making a determination as to what direction a person's foot was pointed when it happened, or being able to look at certain class characteristics. I think most of us can look at one shoe impression and see that the pattern is uniquely different from another one, but that's not the same as having two impressions in front of you and then being able to say this one was made by this shoe. That I don't do, but the other aspect I do.
Right. And then also with respect to shoe impressions, you're familiar with and can testify about the proper procedure for collecting shoe impression evidence and how to set up a proper comparison for a shoe impression expert, correct?
That's correct, yes.
That's all part of crime scene processing and reconstruction?
Yes, yes.
Okay. Anything else based on that? At this time, I would tend to wait.
You can proceed.
Thank you. In the course of preparing for this case, did you have an opportunity to review crime scene photographs taken by law enforcement?
Yes.
May I approach the witness, Your Honor?
No.
And for reference, this is defense composite exhibit 6A through 0000060. Take a look at that.
All right.
Are those the pictures that you look at in forming your opinions about this case?
Yes, those are, I had a large number of crime scene photos, and then what's contained in there are ones that I specifically pulled out to use to reference for my analysis.
Those are fair and accurate depiction of the photos that you use to form your opinions in this
Yes,
case, correct?
yes.
This time, Your Honor, I would move into evidence what's been pre-marked for identification only is defense defense 6A through 00000 and has that exhibit number.
6 O's you're talking about?
Six
How many
letter
pictures
O's,
we talking about?
whatever that equates to. It's about 200, I would say.
I think it's 173 total.
So,
I do have concerns, Your Honor, regarding the redundancy of many of these photos. I think there needs to be a closer look at it, make sure in establishing the use of them, because obviously we're talking about a lot.
Stated already stipulated to the admission of these pictures, but he's gonna go through a PowerPoint presentation and explain how these photos factor into the opinions that form.
any other objection?
No, Your Honor.
They'll be admitted.
Let's start with your going through your PowerPoint presentation and explain to the jury kind of step by step what your analysis of the crime scene processing was in this case. Did you prepare a PowerPoint presentation in this case to help the jury understand your testimony?
I did, yes.
And would that PowerPoint presentation assist them in understanding your testimony?
Yes.
Do you have that for us to utilize?
Well, I have it on my iPad for me. I didn't know if I needed to, I can get it to set up, but I don't have it right now.
Okay. It's about 5 to 5. Do you want us to break right now, Your Honor?
Yeah. Y'all gonna get that so we can use it on
First
the
thing in the
camera
morning.
here?
Yes, sir.
Have you made arrangements with court admin to get some help on that?
I have not, but I can make those arrangements this evening.
Might be a little late, but anyway. All right, I'm afraid we're gonna need to break then. We're pretty close. Whatever time we don't do now, we do tomorrow or the next day. So I'd just like to keep everything moving. So, but anyway, I did want to go ahead and let's talk about. I know at least Ms. Barber and maybe some others had indicated that they were planning to take children to school Monday morning for the start of school. What time can we reasonably start by? What time does school start?
Well, middle school doesn't start till 9:30, but all the stuff will start at 9.
Okay. Middle school doesn't start till 9:30 now? My goodness. Yeah, that's, so the 9:30, everybody can do that. Now, does anybody, I know there's kind of some variation on school start. Does anybody have kids that are starting tomorrow? I don't know. All right, so if we plan on Monday at 9:30, everybody can accommodate that. Nobody has any special problems tomorrow. Okay. All right. Well, don't discuss the case among yourselves. Anyone else? Watch any media accounts. Listen. Be back here tomorrow at 8:30. Parking working out all right? Sure. All right. All right. Is there a question, Mr. Fletcher? Oh, okay. All right. All right. 8:30 tomorrow. We'll see y'all. Okay.